Hi, Andreas from Toddle here, and welcome to day 2 of Learn Toddle in 7 days. So this is, of course, the video series where we are going to go and build 7 projects in Toddle that are increasingly complex. And by the end of those 7 days, you should have a really good idea of how Toddle works. You should be able to go and build that project that you've been waiting to build. Right? Today, we are going to be building a iTunes search page. So this is basically where we search through the iTunes music catalog and we list results based on that. We'll be able to preview, like play audio previews, and then add some links to the actual iTunes store, right? So we'll build this little search app for iTunes Music that we can show and share with our friends. We're going to be building on what we learned in the first video of building a weather app. So I really recommend, if you haven't watched that, go and check out that first. That's kind of going to apply for all these videos. We're always going to be adding on to the knowledge we learned in the previous ones. So I really recommend watching them in order. So we're going to start by creating a new project. And so I'm going to go and create a web app. And again, I'm going to use the blank template. I'm going to use the blank template for all these projects because I kind of like starting from a blank slate and then adding the things I want, right? So we're going to call this iTunes underscore search. And do we have a nice emoji icon that goes with this in our standard? I think we're just going to pick the little guy sitting on his laptop for this one. The emoji icon doesn't really matter. Like it'll show up as a default fav icon if you don't set one, but you can obviously go and set your own fav icon for the site as well. Fav icon is the little icon being shown on the top of the page here on your tab. So we've loaded our page just like we did with the weather app. The first thing I want to do is add in the API. I really like working with real data from the start, even before I start designing anything. I like having the actual data because sometimes that kind of influences the design. Sometimes you need to adjust some of your layout based on what is the actual content coming back looking like. So I really prefer working with the real data from the scratch. So I've got this URL here, which is from Apple, and it's basically some documentation for their search API. I'm going to link that in the description so you can use it as well. And this basically explains how you're going to be working with this API. So since Toddle kind of works with any backend or any API, whether it's like a fully coded backend or it's like in this case a search API from some third party, each API often works just a little bit different. Like they'll slightly change what are the parameters you can add in based on the use case. And as a result, we often have to go and check out the documentation for each API because you can't always sort of guess what it's going to be. So here we can sort of read through and we can see, well, we've got this URL pattern and it says something's parameter key value. We're actually going to go and see if we can find an example. There should be one a little bit further down. So here we have some lookup examples. There should be some search examples right here. So here's a Jack Johnson search term, right? So I'm just going to copy the URL right here. And we can see it says iTunes apple.com/search. And then it's got this question mark term equal Jack plus Johnson. So the slash here is the path of URL and the question mark is the query parameters. If you're not familiar with URLs or really know how they work and how they're structured, we wrote a whole blog post on that. I'm going to link that in the description as well. If all this seems super weird, maybe pause the video, go check that out and then come back. But otherwise, I'll continue here. So we're going to copy the URL for the search here. And I'm going to go back to my app and then I'm going to create a new API. I'm going to call it iTunes search. This is going to be a GET request that was listed in the API as well. And I'm going to paste this in here. And what Toddle does when you paste the new URL in, assuming there's nothing in place of it, it's actually going to start parsing it. So we talked about how part of it was this path, the search part, right? This bit here. And then these queries. And queries or query params are like little extra information you pass along to a URL after the path, right? In this case, the term here is basically, we add one query param called term, and the value here by default is Jack Johnson, right? And we can see here that returns the data immediately because we've got our auto fetch on. And we get back some data. We've got a result count. There's going to be 50 results. That is because there is a default limit on that. I think we can actually add another one of like, if we wanted only 20. I think that should be possible. Yeah, we get 20 results back. But actually 50 is fine. So this is just another bit of information we're passing along to the service. And I knew it was a limit here because I read the iTunes search API. It's in here somewhere. I think limit, you can pass that in, right? And you can get between 1 and 200. 50 is actually fine. Now we've got all this database, the result count, and then of course the results. And we can see that's going to be, so we got our data, results, and each result got a bunch of data on it, right? Got a bunch of properties. We've got a wrapper type. Not 100% sure what that means. So all the data coming back here, and I think we mentioned this in the last video as well. This is the service, or whoever built the service makes these calls, right? They want to add something called wrapper type track. Okay, what kind of track is it? It's a song, yeah. An artist ID, collection ID, track ID. All these are probably very useful if you're really integrated into the Apple iTunes ecosystem, but they don't really mean anything to us now. So we're gonna lightly ignore them, right? Then we've got artist name. This bike is a pipe bomb. Okay, fair enough. Collection name, 3-way, yeah, and track name, Jack Johnson. So probably not exactly what we were expecting in this case, yeah. But we can see, I assume there's some Jack Johnson actual songs as well. But we've got all this information coming back. And then some of the interesting things down here is we've got some different types of media URLs. So we've got an artist view URL. This is, as far as we can see, if we just do some shift scrolling here, these are just links to Apple Music, right? So we can add them in as links. But we also got like a preview URL. And this is actually, if we look, we can't quite see, MP4, right? So this is actually a little audio track. And then right here, we've got 3 different artworks, and they are called artwork URL 30, artwork URL 60, artwork URL 100. Now, we don't exactly know what that is yet, but a qualified guess would be that it's the artwork for that track or that album. And then probably 30 by 30 pixels, 60 by 60 pixels, 100 by 100 pixels. That's going to be my guess. Then here we've got a price on collection and a price on this track. So we can basically, collection, I'm pretty sure means album in this case, would be my best guess, right? You can buy the album, you can buy the track from iTunes. Right, so this, and we can actually see this even more. There's a lot of information coming along here, right? We're probably not going to show all of it. But now that we have this, we can show that in our application. And this is going to be somewhat similar to what we did in the weather API, or so the weather app, but with one little difference, because in this case, the results coming back is in an array. So an array is essentially a list of items, and it's a data structure, we call it, which is like a way we store a lot of similar data, and we store it in a list here. So this means that we want to show one item on screen, like we want to show a list on our app, and we want one item for every result coming back here. So let's try and do that. We'll leave in this template for now. We can always restructure our UI. So right now we're just going to get some elements on screen, and then we can look at styling and layout later, right? So I'm going to select the root element and click plus, and I'm going to add a list. And list adds this UL. It actually adds a little block, not just a single element, but a little block of content here with what's called a UL element. UL in HTML is short for unordered list. And then there's an LI, which is a list item. So in this case, it's an unordered list because essentially the ordering is not relevant. Otherwise, you would use what's called an OL, which is an ordered list. Like, maybe we semantically should use an OL, but I don't really know that the ordering is relevant for this case. We're not really doing ordering. So we can always decide to swap that out later and use an OL. Actually, maybe it does make sense. Let's be semantically correct. I think that's always good. So I'm just going into the attributes section here and changing the tag to OL. Now this matters a little bit. I don't think this is the most critical one, but essentially, again, if toddle if your website is being scanned by search engines, which are crawling websites all the time, or if any of you are using assistive technologies like screen readers, using the correct HTML really does matter, right? Because it is the difference between whether that technology understands the content, what is in here, right? It doesn't look at the screen, like it doesn't process the visual part of your application. It just actually reads all this out here and then tries to get an idea of what is the content that is in this application. And that applies both to search engine crawlers and screen readers. So using the correct HTML here just means that you're going to get better search rankings, and also that people who maybe have a hard time seeing, which might be some of the ones who want to use a audio search app in this case, right? They can actually still use your app without even completely blind people would be able to use it and still get a lot of benefit from it, right? Let's do a little bit of styling. I'm gonna open my style tab here, and I'm gonna start by saying I want this to be with 100%. So when we're working with layouts specifically, we sort of sometimes differ between styling and layout. It's a little bit of there's a little bit of bleed between the terms, but we often refer to styling as how something looks, and layout is how something is positioned relative to the elements, right? So the width in this case, we're sort of saying is part of the layout. It's part of how much space does it take on the page, right? And Toddle uses something called flexbox, which is a very common algorithm for layout on the web. And what it basically says is you can either lay out items in a column format, which is what we're doing here. I'm selecting my root element here, right? And you can see we're laying it out in a column format. And you can see here in the layout section of the layout panel here in the style section, right, is that we've got flex selected as layout. And then we've got an arrow down saying we're laying it out in the column direction. And then over here, we have a little sort of alignment tool. And this basically lets us decide like how should it be aligned within this element, right? And we are right now aligning in the middle. Maybe we should align it to the top like that. That's probably actually better for our case, right? So we are saying content should be center top. And then we've added some padding here. So we're not actually going all the way to the side. These two here says this is the horizontal padding and vertical padding of 32 pixels, right? This was already set by default in the template. I'm fine with that, so I'm gonna keep it, right? The last thing we want to do is there's this little property here. This is gap. If we hover this, we can see gap between elements. I'm gonna set that to 16 and add this space in between these elements, and it adds that even space between all the elements. And again, all of this we can adjust later if we don't want it to look exactly like it does, right? But this is fine for now. So let's get back to it. We were doing a list item, and we wanted to repeat over each element in our API, right? So I've added this list now. So I've got it on, but I've just got these 3 items, and it doesn't at all know about our API. Like it's not, these things are not connected at all right now, right? So what I actually want to do is a little counterintuitive. I want to start by deleting 2 of them, because it's sort of the list comes with these 3 examples, but in reality, we're only going to have one list item here. But what we are going to do is we're going to repeat that list item for every item in the array we got back from our API. There's two ways you can do that. You can either right click here or click repeat, or in attributes you also have the repeat section here. So this opens our formula editor. You probably remember that from the last video. What we're doing now is we're adding a node by clicking the plus button. Then we're choosing our API here, iTunes search. And then we're diving into the data. And we got the result count. That was the one that just says 50. We don't really need that for now. We could add that later. Maybe we want to show that somewhere. And then we got our results. And the second I clicked on that, you notice that now all of a sudden we got all these items, because these results are an array, and that's what the repeat formula here is looking for. It's looking for an array it can repeat over. So now we're actually done. We can click outside and close that again. And you can see when we're hovering this, it actually goes way outside the screen because we've got these items all the way down. We can even little short click. If you double click the lower one, it'll sort of resize it to fit the whole screen. I'm going to get that back up because I don't really mind that it's scrolling. I'd rather have a normal, there we are. A normal resize. Let's do this, right? So now we've got all these items repeated, but they're all just saying list items. And again, that's because the text we've put inside it right now, it just says list item. There's no formula telling it where it should fetch this information from. Now, since we want to add a few things inside this list item, I'm actually going to start by deleting the text because I want some more content in here. So we're going to add, first I'm going to add, I think, a span. One span, and I'm going to add, select the text inside this. And we are opening the formulates again here, clicking the FX next to the text. And I'm going to change this from a static value to use this repeat item. So this is a new property that just popped up now. Like we didn't see that before. The reason we see it now is because we're inside this repeat. So whenever we're inside this repeat, we have access to the current item we're repeating over. So this means that for each of these items, for each of these repeats, that repeat item property in our formula is going to be a little bit different. The first one's going to receive the first item, second one, etc. Right? So we're opening this again, and we're getting two properties. We're getting the item. Item contains all the actual data, and we also get the index, which is what is the number in the list. And you can see now it says 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 0 is that this is pretty much unanimous among all programming languages, I think, if not all, that whenever you're working with lists or arrays, the first one is also always called item number 0. It is one of those things that seems super weird when you get started and totally counterintuitive because we're used to calling it the first item. The reality is that once you start doing just a little bit of math on some of these things and working with arrays, it actually makes a ton of sense to start at 0 and work with what is the offset, like how many steps away from the first items are you going. It's kind of a thing you just learn, and you'll forget it a few times. That's fine. Eventually you kind of remember that, okay, yeah, arrays always start at 0. And so it's the same reason in toddle as it is in every other programming languages. Does make a little less sense when you start out, but as you really start working with it and building more complex things, which is usually when you use the index anyway, it actually becomes a lot easier. So I'm not going to use the index because we don't really care what order it is. We're not going to display it. We're going to use the item. And inside this, I've got access to all this data. And if you can see now the information I have is the same bit I had inside the API, right? This data is coming from the API. We're just iterating over each of those results in the search from the API. And then right here, we're seeing the information for each of them. And I'm going to start with, I think, artist name. All right. So now we can see we're getting all these different artist names, right? And we're getting like all sorts of different artists that are writing things on the search term Jack Johnson. Surprisingly few Jack Johnson results, but then again, we're not in control of how the search API works. That might have its own reason for doing that, right? I also want to see what the track is, so I'm going to take this span. I'm going to hold down the Option on a Mac or Alt key on a Windows machine, and then I'm just going to drag this onto the parent element here, the li, and that duplicates it. So you can drag things just around normally on the sidebar. If you hold down the Option key, you can basically copy. So now I'm going to go and change the text on the second one to be, and it is, because we copied it, it's got all the same properties, all the same formulas. So I'm just going to go one step back to the item, and then I'm going to pick the track name instead, right? So now we've got, Force Awakens. Yeah, not sure why that comes up with Jack Johnson. But anyway, as I said, that's not our concern as to why those search results are what they are. That's the iTunes search API coming back, right? So if we go into test mode, we can click play. We can sort of scroll around and browse these results a bit and see what we've got back. So this is all good, a good start. We've got more information coming back from the API, so we can add a few more interesting things. The first thing is we got these artwork URLs. So let's go to the list item here, click add, and then we're gonna find under media. Normally I just search, but you can browse the category as well. So we're gonna under media, and we will pick an image. And by default, these images are massive because it fits the default one we have. Don't worry about how it messes with your layout. When we add the correct image in, it'll kind of adjust itself. So we're going to select the image, and then the way images works in HTML. So images are kind of a special element. We talked a little bit in the last video about how some elements have special properties attached to them. Where, for example, a span or an li, they don't functionally work different than anything else. Like all of these other elements functionally are the same. The difference is that semantically they tell the browser, I am this kind of content, but it doesn't in any way affect how your app works. It's just information you're passing along, right? It's kind of metadata for the browser to understand. Images are different, like the img tag here, which is the one or element, which is the one we use for images, actually has some real functionality attached to it. So if you added an attribute of source or src, which is the actual name, but it's short for source, it will display that image inside that element. If we add the same property to a span, it's not going to do anything. It doesn't know what to do with that. You'll just have an attribute called span on it. So images is one of those elements that have attached functionality to it. And we can use that, of course, in this case, to display this image, but we can also change what that attribute points to, right? So like we do with text, where we can sort of say, well, I want to either set this directly or I want to use a formula. We can do the same for attributes. And again, with the formula, I'm not telling it as much what the image is. I'm telling it where from the information or the data of this component, where do you find it, right? And then it'll go and find that data and show it. So in this case, I'm saying repeat item, because again, for each item in the list, it's going to be a different value. And then I'm getting, we're scrolling down and finding this artwork URL. And I think we'll just do the 100 by 100. And what we'll notice is it's still quite large. So I'm going to go in my styling panel and I'm going to resize that. I'm going to give a width of 100 and a height of 100. So now we're getting back to something that looks a lot better, right? This looks pretty decent. That looks pretty good in my book. Let's do some layout. Well, it works. It doesn't actually look very good. So I'm going to move the image up to the top of this list item. But I think I actually want this on the left and then the text on the right. So I'm going to go and take these two elements. I'm going to go and wrap them in a div block. So the div here is because it semantically, like the browser shouldn't care semantically. It doesn't mean anything that they're in a div block. I'm just doing this because I need the layout to work, right? I'm not doing it because it means anything to the browser. It doesn't change the meaning of my app in any way. It's just I need to do some layout, right? So I'm adding a div here, and that's why div is the preferred one in this case, right? Because I really don't need the browser to put any sort of meaning into what this element is, right? So now that I've added them to the block, I can take this list item. And we had this flexbox layout. We talked about how by default it lays everything out in a column, but we can switch that over, right? So I can say I want this to be a row layout. And in this case, let's add some gap as well of maybe 16 pixels is pretty good. So that gives us the little gap in between those two items in our layout, right? And the last thing I want to do is I want to take this bit and I actually want to say, well, you should take up the remaining part of the space. So this is a little bit different where in the OL here we said, I want you to take up all of the space. Where with this div, we don't want it to take up 100% of the space, the full width. We want it to take whatever is back when the other elements have taken their bit. And we can do that by actually going into this little ... in the size section and then set the flex property. So flex is again here, we're talking about flexbox, right? Flex on an item inside a flex. So we say that the parent here, the UL, is using flexbox layout. As you can see here, there are other options and we'll cover them at later times. But when you're in a flexbox layout like this, the child here, the div inside, can have a flex property. And if we set that to 1, not $, that was a miss. If we set that to 1, we can see that it's now going to take up all the remaining space, but it's still going to respect the little bit of padding we have here. And it's still going to respect the fact that this image takes up some of the space. So the flex property here, there we are, basically means I want you to grow and shrink. There's two, you can set them separately. This pretty much is never something you need to do. So most of the time, just setting flex is fine. But it's basically saying, I want you to grow and shrink inside this container. Now, the reason why it's a number is because you can have multiple elements in the same layout actually grow at different factors. So if you set one to grow 2, and to flex 2 and the other one to flex 1, the flex 2 will always try and take up twice as much space as the other one. While still, but it's not necessarily 2/3 and 1/3, right? Because it's off the remaining space. So that's why it's kind of different than just setting like, you wouldn't get the same effect by setting like width 100. Like if we do that, for example, right? 100%. What we'll see here is, well, actually, while we still have flex, that doesn't matter, but here we go. If we do that, we can see now this is actually flowing outside. So that's not what we want to do, right? We want to say flex. Perfect. This looks pretty good. Let's go and maybe change the size. I'm going to go with, yeah, base is actually fine. We'll make this one smaller, I think. Is that a bit? That's a bit too small. We'll bump them up, both of them. Large, and then this one should be small. Right, and maybe we'll change the color here. So I've got a gray. I'll do gray like that. That looks a bit better. The last thing I want to add here is the little audio preview. So basically allowing you to play a little preview of this audio. We don't have access to the full one because obviously iTunes and Apple Music is not a free service. So they're not going to let us just build an app where we can play all the music for free without anyone logging in. But we can get a preview. So I'm going to go inside this div because I want that on the bottom here along the way. I'm going to click the plus button, and I'm going to go in media and add audio. Right, that looks pretty good. And then on that, let's just do the layout first, because this sort of clumps together a bit much. So I'm going to actually add another block in here. We're going to add another div. In this case, I'm just pressing the E for element catalog. So I skip pressing the button here. So shortcut, just pressing E, you go directly open the element catalog, and you can just search and hit enter to select that div, right? So I'm going to move that up here, and we're going to move these two elements inside it. Now, the reason why I'm doing that is because now I can do the same flex trick as before and say, I want you to flex 1. And that means that that container up here is going to take all the space remaining, and thereby giving a very nice sort of alignment. It allows me to say, well, this top one should take all the space available, and then the last one should be at the bottom. And by doing that, I'm basically aligning everything up with the image on the left, right? So I get this nice alignment. I'm just going to go on the audio element, and we're going to give it a little bit of border radius because it's a bit aggressive. There we go. So this looks pretty good. Obviously, this doesn't really work because we haven't wired it up, right? So if I go to play now, I don't know if the audio actually comes through, but this is our default song, which is Yellow by Coldplay, and they're actually all going to be the same. All of them is going to be the same because we haven't told it where to get the audio from, so it's just whatever our default is set. This works exactly the same way the image does. We're going to click the FX button, and we're going to pick out the repeat item. And then we're going to scroll down to find our preview URL. That's the one we're looking for. That is the URL for the preview audio. And the audio element, again, just like the image element here, audio is a functional element. I think that's pretty clear from what we've introduced here. There's quite a lot of functionality into that. So that is an audio player that you can add there. This comes directly built into the browser, right? It's not a toddle specific things. But this basically, you provide that with a source. You can give some other things. Should I loop this? Should I keep looping it? Oh, no. Should it be autoplay? No, that probably wouldn't be great either. Actually, that's almost never something you want. There's a few cases, but generally you want people to be able to control when they're playing music on their websites, right? And you can set, do I want to show the controls? And again, in this case, I do want to show that because we want people to be able to see it, right? So these are some of the information. You can learn a lot more about that. We've got some information in the element catalog. You can also go and look up pages like MDN. I'll actually link to some of these things, like information about the elements I've used in the description as well. So now we've done that. Let's press play and try it out. I'm not 100% sure that computer audio goes through the video. It might not, but here we're basically getting some audio bits we can see. Surprisingly little actual Jack Johnson. I think it seems like we're searching mainly for, well, we've got some Jack Johnson content, right? But yeah. So that's pretty much the app. I think I want to add one more thing, which is that right now our app only ever shows Jack Johnson content, right? Which is, great because, I like him. But at the same time, maybe not that useful. So it would be nice if we could put in the search term for what we actually want to see. So I am going to go and remove this paragraph. We'll change this to search iTunes, right? And then in here, I want to add a new, I want to add a search field in here, right? So I'm going to pick the root element, and I'm going to add an input. And this is actually under form, and then you can pick input field. Now by default, it gets added as the last element. So we're just going to drag that up to be aligned, right? And you can collapse a bit if that makes it. We want this sort of structure saying with the title at the top, then this input, and then our list, right? And we're going to go to the style tab and make sure this is 100%. There we are, to take up the full width, right? And since it's a search field, we're going to make the radius, anything that's over like its actual height is just going to turn the corners completely round. So that's what we're going to do in this case. So I'm just adding 99 because then if I do adjust the height later, it's still going to be completely rounded. So again, an input here is the third element we're adding that has like a functional meaning. This is a text input. You can go and type in it. When we use it in toddle, we want that information, like whatever we type, we want to be able to use that in our API call, right? In order to do that, what we first need to do is bind that data into a variable. So variables in toddle are a way to store temporary data, if you say. Like it's information that's temporarily stored in order to use it inside the application. And by temporary here, I mean we're not saving in a database. Like it's only there while the application is running. If I refresh, that variable is going to reset to a default value. So let's go and create a new one. I'll show you what I mean. We're going to create a new one. We're going to call it search. And our default value is going to be Coldplay. The reason we're just setting a default here, it doesn't really matter what the default is. It might make sense to make it an empty string, right? So we're not searching for anything by default. But in this case, I'm just going to put in default and then people can go and change it afterwards. And the default here is the value that it's going to have right when our page loads, right? Before we set it to anything else, it's going to start out being Coldplay. And now I want to do two things. I want to take my input here, and then under attributes, I can go and set a lot of attributes for the input. And there's a lot of default here shown that make sense. Like what kind of type of input is it? There's actually quite a lot. We just want a simple text in this case. The title is going to be search iTunes. We're going to put in a placeholder called search for your favorite song or artist. Right. So that's going to be the placeholder text. That's what's shown when we don't have any value in it, right? Autofocus is basically saying, should this element receive focus as soon as we load the page? And actually, we do want to do that. Now, in order to set that to true, I'm going to use the formulator, because that's where we have Boolean values. I'm going to just use the value true. You can find that in the catalog here, right? True. And what that means now, if I type, if I load this, let's go and load it in a preview in a new tab. We can see immediately that search field grabs focus, so I can actually start typing right away, right? The next thing we want to do here, since we created a variable, we want to use this little bind to variable. And we can then pick the variable we want to bind it to, search, right? The second we did that, you'll notice that it changed the input value to Coldplay. So the value for this input is what is the actual text in the input, right? And what bind to variable actual does is kind of a shortcut. It sets its value attribute to be, if we inspect that, to be our search variable. And also it changes, it adds an event listener over here. And I'll show a little bit about what that means. We'll cover events and these kind of things a lot more in future videos. It's not entirely within the scope of this one, so we're going to brush a little bit over it today. But essentially it says whenever I input, whenever I type, go and set the search variable to the new value that I typed. So it creates this binding here, creates this two options. One saying, always make sure that this input has the value that matches the variable. And whenever the user tries to change anything in the input, make sure you also update the variable. So the result is that if I go and say Radiohead and change that while in test mode, I can now go and inspect my variable and it says Radiohead, because the input value here and the variable are always linked. Now, the reason why we need to do that is because now we can open our API and we can say, well, this value, this search term down here, Jack Johnson, that used to be always Jack Johnson, we actually want this to be the value of the search variable. So I'm going to click the FX button here because, again, this is a dynamic value. We can't tell the API what the value is. What we're doing instead is we're telling it, where do I find it? So I'm opening this, and then here I already got search. And that's as easy as that. Now we're searching for Radiohead, right? One thing I want to do is, because this actually now search every time I press a key, this could get a bit spammy. Like, that means if I'm typing really quickly, it's going to fire off a request for every keystroke to that API and try to get the result back. And as a result, we can try that. Make Jagger. We can. It gets a bit funky, right? It's struggling a bit because we are firing a lot of requests off all the time. So what we actually want to do is say, well, okay, we fired a lot of requests off, and it got really angry. So what we can do in that case, whenever you're having, like, most of the time, it doesn't matter. You're not going to hit the request very often, right? But in this case, we want to debounce it a bit. And what that means is saying, when you keep hammering this API to change, and in this case, because we set this to be using a variable, every time that variable changes, our API, which is set to auto fetch here, means that it's going to say, oh, the variable changed, therefore my whole URL here and my whole specification for the API changed, therefore I need to go and refetch the data. So the API can figure out itself that, okay, something changed, I need to refetch. You don't have to specifically say, go and make a request. You can just say, well, the parameters of your request changed, therefore you should refetch it. But because we're changing that variable so quickly, we need to sort of tell it, okay, calm down a bit. And the debounce is, and I'm going to set this to 100 milliseconds. And what debounce basically says is, whenever you ask me to make a request, I'm not going to make it right away. I'm going to wait 100 milliseconds. And if you haven't asked me again within those 100 milliseconds, then I'll make it. So if I keep hammering it consistently without any break, it's not going to make the request. But the second I pause for 100 milliseconds, it'll make the latest request. And this works really well for search APIs. Because if I go into test mode, and now I can say Beatles, I now did 3 or 4 requests, but that's much, much better than the 10 I did before. And if I do, what's another band? Metallica. I'm actually only making a handful of requests here. It does feel like I'm making a bit more than I should. Debounce, I said 100. No, that's pretty good. So this basically lets me not overly hammer that API by setting this little debounce, right? And so this is basically it. I think one thing I want to do is, this seems to be a little bit off UI-wise. So I'm just going to add a little bit of padding here. We're going to change that to 16 instead. That looks a bit nicer. So now we've basically made our iTunes search app that allows us to search through the iTunes Music catalog, show different results, and play a little snippet. And I'm just going to go and try that in our preview. So this preview is the actual app running. It's not running like inside the editor. It's running exactly the way it would normally. And the first thing I notice is that it kind of looks terrible when it's on the big screen. So let's just quickly go back and fix that. The way I'm going to do that is actually just, I'm going to wrap this whole, I'm going to put in a main. So main is kind of almost exactly like a div. It's not a functional element, but it sort of tells the page that this is the main content you should focus on. You can only have one on a page at a time, but it's actually it fits quite well in this case. I'm going to do that, and then I'm just going to go for that main, fix the styling. gap 16. All right. And then we're gonna give that a width of 900 pixels and a max width of 100%. Yeah, that should do it. Let's try our preview again. So now we're basically saying, well, you should be 900 pixels wide, right? But if I'm resizing and going lower, actually don't ever go outside, right? Always keep within. So this looks a little bit better, right, for the larger screen. And that's pretty much it. We can actually just search for Lizzo if we want to do that, and we'll get search result back specifically for that. And we can go and see the album artwork for each result, and we can press play.
So here we are. You're finally able to listen to this album
and get like a preview message from each result. Right. So I think we'll end it here. I'll just quickly go because for each of them, I think we should always remember to publish. So let's do that. iTunes search. There we are. Publish brands. And now we can go and see our iTunes search on the actual website. And so this is a live one. Of course, link that in the description as well. Thank you very much for listening and watching. Go try this out. Again, the best way of learning Toddle is trying to build all these projects. You probably noticed that there was a lot of data, a lot of information coming back from the iTunes Search API. So there's a lot you could do with this app. I really recommend that you go and try and add some functionality to it. Look at what the data coming back in the API panel. See what information is there. There was a ton of bit about different links to you could link to different parts of the music store. You could show explicit and non-explicit markers for each song. There's so many different things that are available there and you could add to make this app better. So go and try out building the app, exploring, extending it, add your own version, do your own styling, maybe adjust the layout to what works for you. And then make sure you come and tell us, post it on the Discord when you're done. Thank you very much for watching. If this is the first you've ever seen of Toddle, you can go and sign up now. It's free. If this is, we've got more videos coming, so remember to subscribe to our channel. This is only day 2 of our 7 days of Toddle video course. So stay tuned for more videos of this kind. Thank you very much.